The quiet hum of a suburban evening was shattered in an instant. Flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement as officers rushed toward a parked SUV. Inside, a young pregnant woman sat frozen, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She had no idea why she was being pulled over. Before she could even ask, the doors flew open. "Step out of the vehicle." The command was sharp, urgent. Confused, she complied, her swollen belly making each movement careful. But within seconds, hands grabbed her, forcing her to the ground. The rough asphalt scraped against her skin as she gasped. "Please, I'm pregnant," she cried, but her words were swallowed by the chaos. What these officers didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that her husband was no ordinary man. A decorated Delta Force commander, trained for the most dangerous missions, was just minutes away. And when he arrived, the situation would take a turn no one expected. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Would justice be served? Would the officers realize their mistake before it was too late? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The woman lay on the ground, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The officers were shouting commands, their voices firm, but she could barely process what was happening. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not just from fear, but from the life growing inside her. She had done nothing wrong. So why was this happening? One officer pressed his knee into her back, pinning her down as another checked her ID. "What's the charge?" she managed to ask, her voice strained. But no one answered her. Instead, they exchanged glances, hesitating. It was as if they weren't even sure themselves. Meanwhile, miles away, her husband was driving home. Unaware that his world was about to change in an instant, his phone buzzed, a call from his wife, but when he answered, all he heard was shouting. Then the line went dead. A cold wave ran through him. His instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. Without a second thought, he turned the car around and floored the gas. Back at the scene, the officers finally noticed her military-dependent ID. One of them squinted at it, then at her. "Who's your husband?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "He serves in the military," she said carefully. She didn't want to escalate things, but she also wasn't going to let them treat her like this. The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. Before they could respond, the distant roar of an engine cut through the night. Headlights pierced the darkness, moving fast. A black SUV tore down the street, coming straight toward them. The tires screeched as it came to a stop. The driver's door flew open. And in that moment, everything changed. The door slammed shut, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene in an instant. His wife, face pressed against the pavement, the officers still holding her down. His heart pounded, but his training kept him steady. Years of high-stakes missions had taught him how to control his emotions, even in the worst situations. But this was different. One of the officers instinctively put a hand on his holster. "Sir, step back," he warned. The man didn't move. His presence alone sent a wave of tension through the air. "That's my wife," he said, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't shouting, wasn't threatening, but something about the way he spoke made the officers shift uneasily. "She's pregnant. Let her up." The officer gripping her arm glanced at his partner. There was hesitation now, a flicker of doubt. The name on her ID, her husband's demeanor, something wasn't adding up the way they expected. But protocol told them to stay in control. The woman finally managed to lift her head, her eyes locking onto her husband's. Relief flooded through her, but it was mixed with fear. "I told them, but they wouldn't listen," she said, her voice shaky. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we had reason to stop this vehicle." The man cut him off. "Then tell me exactly what that reason was." Silence. The officer shifted, searching for words. It had started as a routine stop, or so they thought. But now, under the intense gaze of a man who clearly wasn't just another civilian, doubt crept in. They hadn't run her plates before pulling her over. They hadn't even explained why she was being detained. Before anyone could say another word, a police radio crackled to life. A call from dispatch. And whatever was said on the other end made the officers' faces go pale. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The officers stood frozen, their radios still crackling with a message that had clearly shaken them. The man's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. He had seen fear before, on the battlefield, in the eyes of enemies who realized too late they had made a mistake, and now he saw it here. His wife slowly pushed herself up, wincing as she cradled her stomach. "I need to see a doctor," she murmured, her voice strained. But the officers still hadn't moved. The lead officer took a step back, his grip loosening on his belt. "Sir, we didn't know," he muttered, glancing between them. His partner swallowed hard, looking anywhere but at the man standing in front of him. The husband took a slow step forward, his stance unshakable. "Didn't know what?" he asked, his voice low and measured. The officer hesitated. The radio buzzed again, another call from dispatch, but this time the words were clear: "Stand down immediately." A cold realization settled over the scene. The officers knew they had made a mistake. But now it wasn't just about them. More cars were pulling up. Higher-ranking officials were arriving. Someone had figured out who they had just tackled to the ground. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be small. The husband exhaled slowly, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't here to start a war. But he wasn't about to walk away without answers. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with every second. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The wailing sirens grew deafening as more police cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the tense night. A senior officer stepped out, his face tight with urgency. He took one look at the situation, the pregnant woman struggling to her feet, the two officers stiff with unease, and the man standing tall, his presence commanding even without a single threat. Then, just as the officer was about to speak, another sound filled the air, a different kind of vehicle, approaching fast. The hum of a powerful engine, smooth but unmistakable. Within seconds, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind the man's car. The doors opened in perfect sync, and out stepped two men in civilian clothes, their movements crisp, controlled. But it was their eyes that said everything. They weren't just bystanders. They weren't just here to watch. The husband didn't react, didn't even turn. He knew who they were before they said a word. One of them stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Commander, we need to talk. Now." The officers exchanged glances. "Commander?" The title hit them like a punch to the gut. They had suspected the man was military, but this was different. Delta Force, Special Operations. A man who answered directly to people far above their pay grade. The lead officer finally broke his silence. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding." The second man from the SUV cut him off with a sharp look. "Yeah, there has," he said. His tone was neutral, but the message was clear. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. The husband's jaw tightened. He had been in high-risk situations before, ones that spiraled out of control in an instant. And right now, he could feel it. Something was happening beyond what was in front of him. This wasn't just about his wife. He turned to the two men. "What's going on?" One of them hesitated, then glanced at the officers. "Not here." And just like that, the night had shifted again. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't over, not even close. The night felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension. The husband studied the two men, their expressions unreadable. Whatever they had come to say wasn't good. But before he could respond, the senior officer stepped forward. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice firm but laced with unease. "We can fix this." The husband's gaze didn't waver. "Fix it." His voice was calm, controlled. "You put your hands on my wife. You threw her to the ground. She told you she was pregnant, and you still didn't stop. And now you want to fix it." The officer opened his mouth, but closed it just as fast. There was nothing he could say. The two men from the SUV exchanged a glance, then one of them turned to the husband. "Commander, we need to leave. Now." His muscles tensed. "Not until I know why." The man exhaled sharply, because this wasn't just a random stop. Silence. The words hung in the air, sending a chill down the woman's spine. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They had no idea what was happening anymore. The man continued. "We intercepted a call an hour ago. Someone put out an alert on this vehicle. An order to detain, no questions asked." The husband's jaw clenched. "Who?" The man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Someone high up." A slow realization settled in. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This wasn't just a mistake. Someone had wanted his wife taken in, quietly, forcefully. But why? And then, before he could process it, the senior officer's radio crackled again. A voice came through, low and urgent. "Abort. Now." The officers went rigid. The husband's eyes darkened. His wife gripped his arm, fear flashing in her eyes. Whoever had pulled the strings was watching, and just like that, the situation was over. But the real question remained: why had it started in the first place? The night's chaos had ended as suddenly as it began. The officers exchanged tense glances before stepping back, their grit on controls slipping away. Without another word, the senior officer gestured for his men to clear the scene. It was over, but no one felt at ease. The husband turned to his wife, his hand gently resting on her arm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but the shaken look in her eyes said everything. This wasn't just fear. It was confusion, disbelief. Someone had wanted her detained, and if they hadn't intervened in time, she might have been taken without explanation. One of the men from the SUV pulled him aside. "We'll look into it," he assured. "But this goes higher than we thought." The husband nodded, but his mind was already racing. He wasn't just going to wait for answers, he was going to find them himself. As he helped his wife into their car, she squeezed his hand. "What if they come back?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "They won't," he promised. "And if they did, he'd be ready." The engine roared to life, and as they drove away, the flashing lights faded in the rearview mirror. But the questions remained. Who had made the call? And why? For now they were safe, but deep down he knew this was just the beginning.